Today, a judge will announce whether or not Derek Chauvin will spend decades in prison. Prosecutors have asked for 30 years, but the former Minneapolis police officer's defense wants probation and time served. CBS News legal analyst Rikki Klieman is here now to talk about what we can expect today. Rikki, it's good to see you. We were together, you and I and Anne-Marie, throughout the trial of Derek Chauvin. The maximum sentence, Rikki, as you know, allowed under the law for second-degree murder is 40 years. What are you expecting from the judge today?
What you're looking at is the maximum sentence, as you said, in terms of the statute, that is the punishment that is allotted for unintentional second-degree murder. However, we look at the sentencing guidelines, and if the judge would not like to be reversed on his sentencing, he will stay within those guidelines. However, in Minnesota, the guidelines are complex. Initially, the guidelines would have been far less, that we would have been looking at a presumptive sentence of about 12 and a half years. But because of a Minnesota procedure that allowed the prosecution to be able to present aggravating factors and the defense mitigating factors, the judge found that there were 4 aggravating factors, and therefore the judge is entitled to double the guidelines, which would have been up to about 15 years, all the way up to 30. So in short answer to your question, what am I expecting when the maximum that we're really looking at is 30 years? I'm expecting something that will be harsh. I'm expecting something that would likely be somewhere over 20 years. I do not expect the presumptive sentence of 12 and a half years at all.
Rikki, I find that very interesting. Can we just sort of go over the guidelines versus the stipulated punishment for said crime, and why? I presume the guidelines are different depending on what state somebody's tried in, and just what goes into the guidelines essentially?
What goes into the guidelines really creates a grid. So what we can look at from the defense side, and you get scores so that you go up or down according to certain factors. From the defense side, we can look at Derek Chauvin as someone who has no criminal history. That is, he has never been arrested nor convicted of a crime. We also look at his mature age. We look at the fact that he has a support system. We look at the fact of his unlikelihood to reoffend. Yet on the prosecution side, the prosecution has asked in terms of aggravators for 5 factors. The judge agreed with 4 of them. The judge agreed that of the aggravators, he abused his position of authority. He acted with extreme cruelty. He committed the crime in front of children. And finally, that he committed the crime with 3 or more people in a group. So that upped his score. So you doubled your score. Yes, you are right that these guidelines do differ from state to state. They differ then from the federal guidelines. And of course, the law differs from state to state. That is, degrees of homicide. We have to remember that in second-degree murder in Minnesota, we're talking about what is normally called felony murder. That is, he did not intend to kill George Floyd. But what Derek Chauvin did intend was to commit a felonious assault. And that is how you wind up with a conviction of murder in the second degree. And for all intents and purposes, since there are 3 convictions that carry 40 years, 25 years, and 10 years, that ultimately he can only be sentenced once because it is one event. So in that regard, he is going to be sentenced, in essence, on the second-degree murder count. Judges like to stay within the guidelines. The maximum under the guidelines here is 30 years. I have certainly heard enough commentary on our TV network, as well as on other networks, that the Floyd family would like him to get the maximum. You have certainly heard commentary from other people that although they feel he should do significant time in prison, they don't believe that he needs to get the maximum.
Rikki, there was an interview earlier this morning on CBS This Morning with Ben Crump and family members of Mr. George Floyd, and they were asked if they wanted to hear it all from Derek Chauvin. Given that Chauvin didn't take the stand in his own defense, do you think that we might hear from him in today's hearing? And is there something that he could possibly say to the judge that would benefit him in some way, or probably not?
Ultimately, the judge has had 2 months to consider what he would do in terms of sentencing. He has had thorough briefing from both sides, so I am sure Judge Cahill will come into court and know exactly what sentence he is going to pronounce, no matter what takes place in his courtroom. And I'm sure he has already written his findings. Nonetheless, it is always helpful for a defendant to express some kind of remorse, to apologize in some way. I heard the interview, I watched it this morning on CBS This Morning, and what you heard from a member of the Floyd family is that she would rather not hear him speak. There is nothing he could say that would make any difference to her. However, I do think that there is a factor of this case being so much in the public domain. We've never had a case where the American public got to see a 9-minute, 29-second murder. So the public also has a desire, I would think, to hear something from Derek Chauvin. You know, we have seen a rather stoic, and I'm being kind, a rather stoic look upon Derek Chauvin's face, both at the time of the 9 minutes and 29 seconds and throughout the trial, understanding that by virtue of COVID, he had to wear a mask almost throughout the trial, and there were only 2 times where we actually got to see his face. And at both of those times, he has that same non-expression. And I do think that people were disappointed that he did not testify on his own behalf. Of course, he has a Fifth Amendment right not to do so. But this is a time where the defendant has what we call a right of allocution. He is not under oath. He is not subject to cross-examination. Nevertheless, it would have to be crafted very, very carefully, because in the event that there would be an appeal and a reversal of this conviction, if that should ever happen, then he does not want to say something that would be considered an admission of guilt. So it's a tightrope, and that tightrope is very thin to apologize and appear sincere. And, you know, defendants, Vlad, they're damned if they do and they're damned if they don't in these kinds of situations. If he says nothing, people will criticize him. And if he says anything, people will find fault with it.
So true. Yeah, it's a tough position to be in. Rikki, thank you very much.
Thank you both.
So stay with CBSN for coverage of Derek Chauvin's sentencing hearing. You can stream that starting at 2 p.m. Eastern. We will also bring you a special report when Chauvin is sentenced.